All right, we're going to pick up in Acts this morning, right after we left off last week, which was at the very end of Acts chapter 15. We'll pick up kind of the very beginning of Acts 16 this morning. So turn your Bibles over there. So when we left off last week, we had finished up with the Jerusalem Council, and Paul and Barnabas were preparing to go back on their second missionary journey. They wanted to return to the area they had visited on the first missionary journey, to revisit those churches, to strengthen and encourage all the Christians there in those cities, kind of in the southern part of Galatia, in that kind of southern Asia Minor area. But there was a conflict between Paul and Barnabas. And what was that conflict that caused them to kind of separate and go different ways? All right, so they had a conflict over John Mark. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them, but Paul didn't want to do that because John Mark had left them about midway or so through that first missionary journey. And so it ended up that they decided to part ways. Paul would take Silas and then revisit the churches in Syria and Cilicia, whereas Barnabas would take John Mark, and then they would sail over to the island of Cyprus. Now, both of those were areas visited on that first missionary journey. So they were going to basically split up and then collectively, between the two teams, recover that same ground. Now, we don't really pick up at all Barnabas and John Mark's journey. All right, they sail off to Cyprus, and we kind of lose track of them. But we assume that they make it to Cyprus and work with the churches there and likely other places as well. But the story in Acts, the narrative, is going to follow the path of Paul and his companion now Silas as they continue their travels, leaving from Antioch, which is kind of their home base church, and then moving up into the area of Cilicia and then on across Asia Minor from there. So that brings us then to Acts chapter 16, where we pick up on their journey. Now, the theme for our lesson today is Paul's second missionary journey. And as we've been going through kind of the life of Paul, we're following his path, his life from Tarsus, where he grew up, all the way to Rome, where he is presumed to have died and finished off his life. And along this roadway, along this road trip from Tarsus to Rome, we are taking note of various road signs that Paul likely encountered along the way, and using that as a way to kind of scaffold our thoughts about Paul's life, about his overall journey. And the road sign that I chose to kind of represent his second missionary journey is the road work ahead sign. All right, now we've gone through a number of road signs so far, and I'm not going to rehash all these today, but hopefully when you see these, it brings to mind some key events in the life of Paul. And we finally finished up last week with the kind of divided highway sign, where Paul and Barnabas would divide and cover more ground. But today we're moving on into our road work ahead sign. So when you're on your trip to work, or when you're driving to take your kids to school, or you're going on that road trip for vacation, and you see this road work ahead sign, you start seeing those orange cones, what comes to mind as you're driving? All right, it's a good idea to slow down, right? There's probably people, there's probably hazards around, so let's slow down a little bit. What else? All right, I'm going to be late, right? I think, oh man, I'm going to be late for work today, okay? Or I'm not going to make it by 8 o'clock to drop the kids off, all right? So there's going to be delays, most likely. Anything else? Maybe improvements. All right, slow down, watch out, because the police are likely there handing out tickets. But this is going to be a long process, but on the other end of this process, we hope the roads are better, right? The whole purpose of road construction is to improve the roads, to take 2 lanes, make it into 3 so the traffic will be more manageable, right? We're trying to make overall improvements along the way. And all of these thoughts I want you to think about as we kind of go through a quick summary of Paul's second missionary journey, all right? These ideas around detours, around delays, around improvements, on all that's happening on Paul's second missionary journey. So Paul's trip here, along with Silas and others, is going to be full of spiritual construction, okay? God is going to be paving new roads for the gospel. Paul's going to visit new cities, plant new churches, convert new Christians. He's also going to revise and restore existing roadways. He's going to revisit those churches that were established in Derbe and Lystra, all right? He's going to revisit those same areas and strengthen, restore them, all right? And he's going to lay new foundations for the church to keep on growing and expanding throughout all these existing and new territories. So just calling your attention back, let's look once again at Acts 15 in verse 36. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they are." So this trip began as let's go back and check on the folks in Lystra, in Derbe, in Iconium, on the island of Cyprus. Let's go back and revisit the churches we planted on the first missionary journey. That's how this began, but it's going to expand so much more from that initial plan. We're going to start by recovering existing territory, and then we're going to go and we're going to explore new territory and meet and convert new Christians in new areas that have not yet heard the gospel. All right, so Acts chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium, and Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. And so this is Paul and Silas and Timothy, went on their way through the cities. They delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were at Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. All right, so Paul and Silas set out from Antioch, their home-based city. And remember, Paul and Barnabas, they go down to the island of Cyprus. Not Paul and Barnabas. John Mark and Barnabas go to the island of Cyprus, but Paul and Silas, they travel up into that area where Paul was from. Remember, he was from Tarsus, which is up in that area of Cilicia. And they travel back to that area, and they're going to revisit those same cities, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, etc. And they meet and they pick up a young man, Timothy, along the way. And then they revisit all those cities we saw back in that first missionary journey, strengthening the church. So the first point to think about for today is that road work requires a team. All right, when you are driving down the road and you see that road work ahead sign, it's unlikely you're going to see one worker. All right, you're going to see a whole group of people working together. And that's what Paul has with him. He has Silas that he picked up in Antioch. He picks up Timothy in Lystra. And then even down the way, he's going to pick up another man named Luke. Look down at verse 10. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia. There's a sudden change in the use of pronouns in the narrative. It's been they and he, but now the writer uses these personal plural pronouns like we and us, implying that the author is now part of the team, and that author is Luke. So Luke is also going to join this team along the way. But flip over as well to chapter 18. So we're a little bit down the line, but this is still on the same missionary journey. In chapter 18 and verse 18, after this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. So he's going to pick up more people along the way as well. All right, he picks up Luke. He picks up Timothy. He picks up Aquila and Priscilla. His team is growing as he makes his way through this second missionary journey. All right, what began as one man, Paul, is now a whole group of missionaries, a whole group of evangelists and workers doing the work of the Lord. This takes a team effort, and Paul knows that. Paul is extremely talented. He is very, very good at what he does, but he still needs help. He still needs that team, just like we have a team here at Asheville Road. Just like there's a team over in Trustful at Deerfoot, and there's a team over at Hoover and River Chase, and there's a team in India and in China and in Africa. All right? Work of the Lord requires a group of people working together to do the work of God. We all have our strengths. We all have our areas that we need help with. And Paul is going to leverage the use of the team to do his work. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. The writer says, "Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone, when he falls and has not another to lift him up." Think about Paul. When he was in Lystra on that first missionary journey, he was stoned to the point of death. What would have happened had there not been other Christians there to come and to pick Paul up and to carry him on to the next city? What would happen in Damascus, in Jerusalem, when the threats came against Paul's life, if there were not other Christians there to secretly sneak him out of the cities to save his life? All right? Paul cannot be a one-man show. Just like Drew can't be a one-man show. We are all here to support each other. And Paul had a team with him, and that team would grow as he continued to work. But additionally, the next key part of the team that Paul recognized was he's not going to be here forever. And he's got to find young individuals to carry on the work after he is gone. He writes to Timothy twice, 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. And part of those writings are to encourage this young man that he picked up right here on the second missionary journey to keep the faith, to keep the strength, to continue working for the Lord. He wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2, "What you have heard from me in the presence of many, all that I've taught you, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." Paul says, Timothy, my protege, my son, he calls Timothy his son. I've taught you so much in the time we've spent together. I want you to teach all that to other people, because I'm not going to be here forever, and neither are you. There has to be a chain of succession in carrying out the work of God. And that's our job as well. Is all the young people in their classes in the back of the building, it's our responsibility to, number one, teach them. Because none of us are going to be here forever. And there has to be young men and young women to carry on the work of God. But even beyond that, we have to instill in them, hey, you've got even younger people that you've got to teach as well. This is a two-pronged thing. Teach the young people, instill in them the gospel, the importance of the gospel, but instill in them the need to even teach the next generation to keep that work going. And that's what Paul is setting up right here. It began with John Mark. It's going to continue here to Timothy and to Silas and to others. Paul is leaving behind his young individuals so that when he's gone, they're going to be established in their faith, trained as missionaries to continue the work of the Lord. Number 2, we move on to our Macedonian call. So let's pick up here in 16 and verse 6. And they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they come to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they came to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man in Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. All right, so Paul is making his way across that southern area of Galatia. So Antioch up to Cilicia, across southern Galatia, where Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, all those were. And they are told by the Spirit, I don't want you to go into Asia. So we're going to put an X right there on Asia. And this is not the continent of Asia. This is kind of the province of Asia. Okay? So then they try to make their way up into Phrygia and then eventually north into Bithynia. But then they also get a message from God. That's not the plan I have for you. Paul gets a vision of a man from Macedonia across the Aegean Sea. And that's where Paul is told by God to go. Now, why might God have not wanted Paul to go into Asia or north into Bithynia? Well, look over at 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. This is Peter writing. To those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, in Galatia, in Cappadocia, in Asia, and Bithynia. There were already Christians in those areas that had moved there after the diaspora, after the dispersion. Remember, Christians, they left Jerusalem and those areas because of the persecution, and they traveled everywhere. And then when they traveled, they carried the gospel with them. Peter's going to write to those Christians in those areas later on in his life. But God has a plan. God knows, I've got men working in Bithynia. I've got men working in Asia. Paul, I need you to go across the Aegean Sea. I need you to go over into Macedonia. Sometimes road work requires temporary detours. Paul had his plan, but he was flexible. He was nimble, and he listened to God's instruction. God told him, I need you to go here, and so that's where Paul went. All right? We got to have plans. All right? I'm a planner. I'm a type A person. I got a plan for everything. I map my day out. Right? But we also got to be nimble, right? We got to be flexible because sometimes plans change. And sometimes we have to open our eyes and open our ears and watch and listen for God's way of telling us what His plan for us is going to be. And it might align with your plan, or maybe it causes you to deviate from your plan and go a little bit different direction. But Paul had his eyes open, he had his ears open, and he listened to God's redirection. To go a different way, this is where the work is needed. This is where you are needed to strengthen the work. In Proverbs 16 and verse 9, the writer says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." It's okay to have a plan. I encourage you. I'm a planner. right? But ultimately God sets our steps. Jeremiah 29:11, a verse that we've all heard before. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And then in Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6, another well-known passage. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. Trusting in God, watching for His direction in our lives. Okay, so Paul is going to take his group, and they're going to cross over from Troas and move on over there into Macedonia. All right, kind of the modern-day Greece area. All right, so we pick up then in verse 11, and we're going to have to move through this quickly because we don't have time to cover a few highlights here. But what I want you to think about as we go through this next section is road work is all about building new roads and building new bridges. Up to this point, Paul has primarily been revisiting cities that he's already been to. But now this is new territory. Now Paul is going to be building new roads and building new bridges on the other side of the sea. So he sets sail from Troas there in verse 11, and he goes over to Samothrace and then Neapolis, and then he ends up in a city called Philippi. All right, and he's going to spend some time in Philippi, and a few key things are going to happen in Philippi. Number one, they go down to the riverside, and they meet a lady named Lydia, a seller of purple, and they convert Lydia there by the water. After they convert Lydia, they continue to preach in the area there of Philippi. And then in verse 16 and following, they had this encounter with a girl who was possessed by a demon, and they're kind of being very annoying to Paul, following him around. And probably Paul doesn't want people thinking that a demon is part of his entourage. And so Paul cast out this demon. And that makes those who are with her, using her for money, not very happy. And so ending up, they're going to throw Paul and Silas in prison. And then we have the whole account where God, uses that prison to lead to the conversion of the Philippian jailer, a story that we're all familiar with. All right, and we'll come back to this a little bit more a little bit later on. But then they spend some more time there in Philippi. And then in chapter 17, they move on eventually to Thessalonica. And they're going to have conversions there in Thessalonica. And they move on into Berea. And they have more Christian converts in Berea. Every city they visit, there's some bad stuff that may happen, but they establish new churches. They're planting the seed, and they're seeing fruit reaped from those seeds that they plant. All right, and then toward the end of chapter 17, they eventually leave Berea, and they go on then to Athens. And Athens, this is one of my favorite stories from Acts, when Paul is up on the Areopagus, and he preaches the sermon about the unknown God, the statue, the idol to the unknown God. I love that story. And then eventually he leaves Athens and goes on to Corinth. There he meets Priscilla and Aquila, and he spends about 18 months or maybe longer in Corinth, establishing, working with the new church planted there in Corinth. And every single time he visits a city, Christians are converted. All right, look at 17. In verse 4, and some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. That's in Thessalonica. All right, look over in verse 10, where they move on to Berea. The brothers ended up in Berea. They preach in the synagogues, And then in verse 12, many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. And then look over here in 18. They end up in Corinth, and they meet Aquila, and they meet Priscilla. And it's a longer reading here, but as you read through, they convert Crispus down in verse 8, the ruler of the synagogue. They're having success in every single city they go. God is using them to expand His kingdom. This is why God said, I need you in Macedonia. That's where the work is right for you and Silas and Timothy and Luke. Your team is needed there. And they're going to work through these areas, planting churches along the way. But we also know that road work is messy, right? Whenever you see that construction ahead sign, you expect to see a lot of tar, a lot of freshly poured asphalt, a lot of ripped up concrete, a lot of dirt and mud. Road work is a messy process. And Paul experiences his share of messiness along the way. Look at Acts 17 and verse 6. This one kind of sums it all up, really. In 17 and verse 6, and when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, these men have turned the world upside down. That's a summary of what Paul's doing. He is turning the world upside down. He is converting Jews from Judaism into Christianity. He is converting Greeks from paganism, from Roman mythology into Christianity. He is completely changing the landscape of every single place that he visits. And just like when you're changing the landscape of the highway, you have to mess some stuff up before you can rebuild it better, cleaner, and stronger. All right? But these mainly Jews in each city, they don't like things being tore up. They like their old highway. They like their potholes. They like their grass growing in the seams. All right? They don't want a newly paved road. They don't want new stripes on the highway. They like things the way they were. And so they're going to cause a lot of problems for Paul all along the way. Paul's going to face beatings. He's going to face imprisonment. He's going to face rejection and discouragement on this trip alone. But let's look over 2 Corinthians and kind of see a big picture of just Paul's life in general. All right? Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm going to read beginning in verse 24. Oh, I'm in 1 Corinthians. I'm like, wait, this is not right. 2 Corinthians 11. All right, verse 24. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. We saw that one already in Lystra. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brethren. In toil and hardships through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety, my worry for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? This is a summary of Paul's experiences throughout his mission work. Now, some of these we read about in his second missionary journey. All right, he's going to be beaten. He's going to be imprisoned. He's going to be thrown out of cities. There's going to be mobs dragging his friends out of their homes. There'll be mobs beating the new converts. Imagine, you convert someone to Christianity, and a few days later, they get beaten for that. Not only is Paul getting beaten, the people that he converts are going to get beaten. Right? Paul's carrying all that with him. But he doesn't stop. He doesn't stop. He doesn't pause. He's going to keep on going because his eye is on the destination. His eye is not on the messy work around him, the mud, the potholes, the tore up roadway. His eye is on that vision of what this will look like when it's all done. His eye is on the final product. Because road work is transformative. Road work takes us from that left image, the before, that mud puddle, to the brand new roadway that you see there on the right. That's what Paul has in his mind. All right? It's easy for us to get bogged down in the left because we think about the present. Our minds dwell on right now so much. And it can be challenging to get past the now and the was and think about the can be, to think about the what if, to think about the future. But that is core to evangelism. Not the discouragement of getting turned down or rejected, not the heartache of being persecuted, literally, like Paul was, but the what if, the future of what might happen tomorrow or next year, or maybe 15 years down the road. You never know what you do today, what impact it can have even years down the road. All right? But that's what Paul is keeping in his mind, is what things can look like when it's all said and done. Road work is transformative. We saw that with Lydia. In Acts chapter 16, there in Philippi, Lydia becomes a Christian. Also in Acts chapter 16, the Philippian jailer is going to be converted to the gospel. And look over at Acts 16 with me. I think this is really, really interesting. When you read the story of the Philippian jailer in Acts 16, look in there at verse 29. So this is after they've been imprisoned, after the earthquake, after all the doors were opened. The jailer comes running in verse 29, called for the lights, and rushed in, trembling with fear. He fell down before Paul and Silas and brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" I don't think he meant, "What must I do to be saved spiritually?" I think he meant, "What do I have to do to not die?" Because he's just literally been pulled away from taking his own life with a sword. Because he knows, I was in charge of these prisoners, and they're all going to escape, and that's going to cost me my life. Paul halts him. Don't kill yourself. We're all right here. And so he says, what do I have to do to be saved? I think he means literally my life. But Paul has another plan. Paul says, believe in the Lord Jesus and you'll be saved, not just physically, but spiritually. And Paul preaches to him the gospel. The Philippian jailer went from, I'm going to die physically, I just want to live, to now I'm alive spiritually because of Paul and Silas and the gospel. And then we look over at the Thessalonians in 17 and verse 4. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. We read that already. And then we have the Bereans in Acts chapter 17, verses 11 and 12. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And then we have people in Athens, we have people in Corinth, all who were transformed by the power of the gospel. Paul went on to write in Romans 12 and verse 2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect." And then he wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 18, "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." What does the transforming? "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. The word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, joints and marrow, discerner of thoughts and intents of the heart." The gospel is doing the transformation. The gospel is taking that dirty, muddy area and changing it into a brand new roadway. All right, and then finally, road work is ongoing. When Paul visits these cities and establishes the churches there, he's going to come back. He's going to revisit those cities with subsequent missionary journeys. And he's going to go on and he's going to write letters to those Christians. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Thessalonians, Corinthians. Paul knows that one visit, even 18 months of time spent in a city, isn't enough. This requires ongoing effort. And that ongoing effort requires, number one, going back, revisiting the cities, encouraging the brethren face to face. It includes communication. He writes letters encouraging those people because he knows that over time, roads develop potholes. Over time, traffic outgrows the size of the road. Over time, the paint stripes begin to wear away. Road work requires constant revisions. We have to patch the potholes. And so Paul's revisits, Paul's letters are all about patching those potholes. And that's part of our work as well. Establishing the church in various locations, creating new brothers and sisters in Christ, but then returning constantly to encourage and strengthen those new converts. Let God's power work in them, but we have to be there as well, our own boots on the ground, to keep that work going as well. And that's what Paul did. But then he also, remember, he established his successors, Timothy and John Mark and others, to carry on the work after he was gone. And all of those lessons, I think, are lessons that we can take from Paul's second journey. All right? Our work is a construction zone. We are building roads as we're driving down them. It requires a team effort. We're building new roads and we are revising existing roads. We're patching holes, and the end result is transformation in ourselves and transformation in other people. All right, next week we're going to move on to the third missionary journey and hopefully draw some additional ideas from that trip. All right, thanks y'all. I'll see you next week.